So again, thank you very much for being here. I am extremely honored, really, to have a conversation with you. I read your book. I loved your book. I agree with your book. I think it provides us people who believe in the good side of humanity with ammunition, with arguments, with a narrative. And thank you very much for writing this book.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad you liked it.
Actually, in Greece, our reading percentages are not very good, but I know that this book did really well. This is a way to humble brag, about myself. The video I did about your book was so successful, I couldn't believe it. It almost did 100,000 views, which is completely unprecedented for a book presentation in Greece.
Well, you must have done something extraordinary. You're really good at explaining the ideas, I guess.
Well, I really liked it. I really, felt that it was a book for me. So it has been a year since it was published in Greece, and I think it has been 2 years and a couple of months since you published it.
Yes. So it was initially published in September 2019 in the Netherlands, and then it came out in April in English, in April 2020. So that was just a month after the pandemic started. Which is sort of interesting timing.
So how was the reception of the book? How was these 2 years? How have they been for you?
Well, pretty extraordinary, The book has now been translated into more than 40 languages. So it's super exciting to be able to speak to so many readers from so many different parts of the globe about the ideas that are in there. And to really understand that this veneer theory, what I talk about in the beginning of the book, the notion that our civilization is just a thin layer, just a thin veneer, and that below that lies raw human nature, right? That supposedly people are just fundamentally selfish. This idea comes back pretty much everywhere. So people around the globe recognize that they're being fed this idea, this cynical view of human nature. So initially, I was wondering, whenever you write a book like this, you wonder, is it just a regional idea? Is it just something for people, I don't know, in the Netherlands, where I'm from, or in Northern Europe, or, I don't know, in the English-speaking world? But it has a much broader appeal. So that was really extraordinary to experience.
Was there anything about the book I've seen you throughout this year debating. Have you changed your mind about anything? Has anything changed from the things that you talk about in the book, in your mind?
So when time passes, obviously you become more aware of the weaknesses of your work. So initially, actually, it was funny. After the pandemic started, a lot of people were saying to me, like, Rutger, do you still believe that most people deep down are pretty decent? Haven't you seen everyone hoarding toilet paper? Now, I must say, I do have a very contrarian view on the issue of toilet paper at the beginning of the pandemic, because you really have to understand the supply chains of toilet paper, I don't want to go in too deep, but it is interesting that actually
really
we were losing a lot of office toilet paper because everyone was going to work. And then everyone shifted to, working at home, and we use a different kind of toilet paper at home, right?
Yes.
Private toilet paper. So suddenly there was an oversupply of office toilet paper and not enough private toilet paper. Now, if you have an increase of just 30-40% in demand of toilet paper, then you're going to be in trouble, right? Because modern supply change, it's all about just in time, just enough, etc. So that's my contrarian view. Actually, there wasn't all that much hoarding. Sure, I mean, journalists can always find someone, who had a huge pile of toilet paper at home. But actually, most of us, did the reasonable thing and bought a little bit more, but that was already enough to crash the system. So long story short, I haven't changed my mind about, how people respond to crises. I think that the pandemic was a very clear example. That's that the vast majority of people, billions around the globe, were willing to radically adjust their lifestyle to stop the virus from spreading further, and there was actually an explosion of cooperation. But I have become more aware of, I think one of the main weaknesses of the book is that, yes, on the one hand, we've evolved to be friendly. We are the result of survival of the friendliest. But on the other hand, that is exactly the problem, right? Friendliness or this yearning that we just want to be liked as humans often stands in the way of justice and truth seeking, right? And sometimes we actually need unfriendly people to move forward.
Since you went into that field, can you elaborate on this? You talk about in the book, for example, you are talking about the teachers in the Milgram's experience, or how they did bad deeds, but there was a noble cause behind that. Or for the Nazis and the terrorists and the role of camaraderie in their actions. So now we see out our modern day villains, which are maybe the anti-vaxxers, or which we have a serious problem right now in Greece and I think everywhere in the world. Can you explain their behavior through this lens?
Yes, I think so. It would be a massive mistake to look at, say, the anti-vaxxers and think that they're just being selfish. Right? And you hear politicians saying that all the time, and journalists as well. Like, oh, these people are not wearing their masks, these people are not getting their shots, therefore they are selfish. That's a complete misunderstanding of the phenomenon. What is actually going on is that these people are part of groups that genuinely believe, that masks don't work and actually vaccines threaten their health. And they are so loyal to that group, right? The friendship is so important here, is that they're even, threatening their own lives by not getting their shots here. So how do you convince an anti-vaxxer? Well, I don't know about you, but I've never really convinced anyone by smugly shouting at the person and saying, you're being so selfish. That tends not to be super effective. So my sister, she's actually a doctor in the Netherlands. And I was talking to her a week ago, and she told me she joined a volunteers initiative of doctors who just go on public squares where people can come up to them, and they're wearing obviously their white coats, and people can come up to them and ask them questions about, the risks of being vaccinated or not being vaccinated, etc. And the first question these doctors ask is not, why are you being selfish? Or, are you vaccinated? Yes or no? No, the first question is, how are you? It's just about establishing a simple human connection. And that is difficult. I completely recognize that, but it is the most effective way, actually, to build trust. So yes, that's something I've been thinking about a lot in the past couple of months, is that all of this, it's all about trust. And yeah, just all this discourse around, oh, the anti-vaxxers they're just being selfish. Well, even if you're right, it's not going to change anything, right? You're not going to convince anyone with that.
Since you mentioned trust, there is a huge problem in Greece. Again, I'm talking about Greece because I'm sure about it. Maybe this is something that goes on everywhere. And I'm going to the chapter about democracy now. You mentioned the 7 plagues of a modern democracy. I think we are sick of every one here in Greece. And the main result, the negative result, is that especially young people don't trust the state, don't trust institutions, don't trust the government. This is a huge part of the anti-vaxxer movement. And you have these wonderful examples of participatory democracies. But we as people, as units, as civilians, what can we do in order to regain that trust? Can we do anything?
So I would say that trust is the most valuable capital that you can have as a country. It's more valuable than, the most beautiful historic buildings, or, however high your gross domestic product is, or the most wonderful technological innovations. Trust is always more important, because trust is basically the oxygen of any society, and especially of any democratic society. If we can't trust each other, then it's basically hopeless, right? Then we need to move to a much more hierarchical bureaucratic system, right? Then you need CEOs, managers, kings, queens, you name it, because, otherwise everything will go to hell. If we want to move to a genuinely much better society, then we got to be able to trust each other first, right? Now, one of the ways to do it is to reframe what democracy actually is. So when we think about democracy today, we think immediately about representative democracy, right? I often call it elective aristocracy.
Okay.
We, the people, we are allowed to choose our own aristocrats, the career politicians. And often they're actually the same people. This is particularly clear in the United States, where you have these dynasties of the Bushes and the Clintons and you name it, which is already a little bit weird. I mean, what a coincidence that the son and the daughter would also go into
so
politics.
Much talent in politics in that family.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it really makes sense to go back to the original Greek idea of what a democracy looks like, right? Where it's not about career politicians, but it's actually the people who are in charge. And what I'm really excited about are all these experiments now being done around the globe where, well, what they basically do is it's called sortition, right? You randomly select citizens from the population to be a politician. We already know it from jury trials, you know, in the US. It's very famous, obviously, but you could easily expand that. And I think this is one of the ways in which you could build trust, because today, those politicians, they're the people, you know, most of us, we've never met them. We don't trust them. But if being a politician becomes a much more normal thing, and if we all would know at least one or two politicians, you know, in our circle of friends or family, then it would become much more normal, right? And we would also realize that it's actually pretty difficult to govern, right? For example, in an emergency situation of a pandemic, I think we often got to remember that there are genuinely really, really hard decisions to be made. And that in a democracy, you can't make everyone happy, right? It's simply impossible. But because, you know, very few people actually share that responsibility, it becomes much easier to stand on the sideline and to be cynical, right? I think often the best thing to do if you want to make people less cynical or less pessimistic is give them responsibility, right? Let's say, okay, well, you're very critical of how we're doing everything here. Well, what would you do? And well, a lot of people say, well, that's never going to work. You know, that's most people are too stupid for that. And that's why in the book, I included a full chapter of successful examples throughout the world of places where they actually practice this kind of democracy.
It is true that we are really proud of our democracy, but the truth is that we remember the voting part, but we always forget the sortition part, the random assignment of office in ancient Greece. And this sounds really counterintuitive in an era where we have the technology and the knowledge and the brain and the algorithms for everything. We go back to a roll of a dice, for example.
Yeah.
It's
I can't agree more. Yeah, I mean, we're very used to the fact that our iPhone or our other smartphones need to be updated every, couple of months. We get a new operating system, but the operating system of our democracy is often centuries old. I mean, in the US, you've got the Constitution that was written at the end of the 18th century, and there have been a couple of amendments ever since, but, it's basically the same as it was at the end of the 18th century. Now, at the end of the 18th century, they didn't have cars, they didn't have planes. The Industrial Revolution had barely started. And it's like you're using a super modern iPhone, but you're using the software of a steam engine,
Yes.
It's pretty crazy if you think about it that way.
You are talking about the news, and in the Planet A, Planet B example, and you say that because the news want to sell, they use fear, they use sensualization of the facts. Every day we need to have something breaking and stuff like that. And you call the news a drug and a danger to our mental health, if I translate correctly from the Greek translation back to English. I agree. I have to say that I agree with what you say. I wanted to know your opinion about the rest of the things that play on television, about shows, about TV series, about movies.
So we humans today, we're pretty obsessed with the kind of food that we put into our bodies, right? The whole modern food movement that I think is a little bit over-obsessed, by the way. If you just, eat a lot of plants and not too much, as they say, then you're going to be fine. But I think we should be just as careful with the kind of information that we put in our heads, because the kind of entertainment that we consume, it's not innocent, right? I mean, we spend hours and hours and hours in front of Netflix, Apple Plus, Amazon Prime, you name it, to consume all these television shows. And all these stories that we consume, they have a message. You know, maybe sometimes it's a subconscious message, maybe sometimes you don't really realize, but many of these stories have a message. Just take one recent example, Squid Game. You know, it was an extraordinary success around the globe. I think it's probably been the most successful series in all of human history. I mean, what is it? More than 100 million people watched it in just a couple of weeks. It's pretty bizarre. And then if you think about what is the message that lies beneath it, right? What theory of human nature does it portray? And it turns out it's just veneer theory once again. It's this old idea that deep down people are just selfish. And if you put enough pressure on them, you know, most of them will crack and will show, you know, just how horrible they are. So the fact that Squid Game was super successful was not because it was new. No, it was actually really old. It was actually something that we were being told, you know, for a long, long time already. You know, the idea goes back centuries, at least. I would say all the way back to the Greek historian Thucydides, you know, who already argued that, you know, when there's a plague or a civil war, that people immediately revert to their baser instincts. And so you can enjoy these kind of series. And I mean, I do. I binge watch Game of Thrones. But at the same time, you got to remember that there's a message behind it, and it does something to your psyche, right? So I think a good antidote here for people would be to go on Apple Plus and watch Ted Lasso. You know, it's a really wonderful series about an American soccer coach who goes on to the UK and coaches a soccer team there. And well, he comes across initially as a very naive and stupid, optimistic man. But, you know, as the series progresses, you start to realize, hey, this guy actually has a pretty realistic view of human nature. And it's a really uplifting story. So, I mean, the summary here is that we humans, we become the stories that we tell ourselves, right? It's never just entertainment. It's never just storytelling. Now, I mean, we're influenced by that in a pretty profound way, I think.
I am tempted to go in a conversation with you and break the boundaries of an interview. The thing with Squid Game is that the hero is supposed to be the one believing in the kindness of human nature because he bets at the end and he wins the bet, whatever. But the whole series gives us the exactly opposite example.
Yeah.
I also agree with you about Ted Lasso. And just to see if I have an ally in this, I read an article a few years ago about how Friends, how a sitcom destroyed the civilization. It's a wonderful article, and they say about these heroes that they don't evolve, they stay the same, and the only one who actually had aspirations and a career, which is Ross, by the way, was taken down, was brought down by the rest of them. And I actually did a video about it in my channel, and the war I received from that video was something completely new. I never expected the French topic to be such a problematic topic for people. They hated me for talking bad about the series.
It's interesting. There is a quote from Nelson Mandela from the end of his presidency when he said, it's not the most difficult to change the world. The most difficult thing is to change yourself. And it's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit ever since publishing Humankind. I mean, everyone can change the world, right? Yeah, let's change the world. Sure, let's do it. But then, can you actually change yourself, right? That's often much more difficult because, I mean, we humans, we're under the pressure of so many incentives that are, you know, mainly come from the social circle that we're in, right? We just desperately want to be liked. We want to be part of our own groups. And so in the past couple of months, I've been reading a lot about slavery. You know, slavery once was completely normal. It was normal in ancient Greece. It was normal you know, in the 17th and the 18th century, pretty much around the globe. Obviously, we all know about the transatlantic slavery and the slave trade. But it was also normal in Africa, in India, in China, among the Aztecs, in the Mayas, in America. It was normal among the Native Americans. In the year 1800, around 3/4 of the world population was the property of, you know, some kind of rich guy in some way or form. 3/4 of the world population. Oh, wow. So if you were standing on a street corner at the end of the 18th century and were proclaiming that we should abolish slavery, 9 out of 10 people would have just laughed and would say, well, that's never going to happen. And maybe the 10th person would say, well, in principle, I agree with you, but obviously that's never going to happen because, you know, it will wreck the economy, blah, blah, blah. And what I've been doing in the past couple of months is to study the history of abolitionism, of the people who were first saying, we got to abolish slavery, right? And who were starting to fight against it. And it turns out these people were often so unusual, right? One of my favorite abolitionists is a man named Benjamin Lay. He lived, at the end of his life, he lived in America. He was a dwarf. He was a hunchback. He was a Quaker, which is a sort of a radical Christian sect of people who have all kinds of weird and strange beliefs. They believe in the radical equality of everyone. And what he would do is, he was basically a social justice warrior before the word existed. So he went, you know, from service to service, where he started shouting at fellow Quakers who also owned slaves, and were saying that he was basically saying, you're the spawn of Satan. And he was doing this in the 1730s, right? So very, very early. And almost everyone thought, well, Benjamin Lay, he's just a crazy dwarf, you know, crazy hunchback, shouldn't take him seriously, et cetera, et cetera. But if we now look back at him, we're like, well, he was right, and the world was crazy. You know, this is one of those issues with friends, right? And wanting to be liked. It makes you more conservative. I don't know what your experience is, but it's also something I've been thinking about in the context of fatherhood. You know, I became a father 4 months ago, and a lot of people say, well, being a parent really makes you more idealistic because, you know, you want to improve the world for your kids. To be really honest, I have the opposite view. I think that there are two de-radicalizing forces in a human's life. The first one is a mortgage, and the second one is having a kid. Because after that, you know, you're so much more focused on your smaller world, right? Which is not, I mean, it's not all that bad, and it's understandable, and I'm enjoying it right now. But sometimes I'm frustrated with it as well, right? Is that the people who truly change the world, well, many of these abolitionists were childless, and many of them actually didn't have a lot of friends, or at least made a lot of people very angry. So that's the paradox, you see.
There is a archetypical question that I saw in a TV series. The actor was wondering, can you be a good man and a great man? Have you seen any good examples in history?
Yeah. It's a good question. You know, there's a wonderful essay that was once written by George Orwell, the British author, about Gandhi. And on the one hand, Orwell says, well, Gandhi obviously lived an extraordinary life, right? And he changed the world for the better in many respects. But on the other hand, I mean, it's almost like he wasn't human anymore, right? It was almost like most people just don't want to be saints. Let's put it like that. I recently read this really funny paper about moral philosophers, you know, people who specialize in answering the question, how can you be a good person? And so they did a poll. They asked more than 200 professors of moral philosophy how often they called their mothers, how much they gave to charity, what percentage of them was a vegetarian, etc. So sort of all kinds of things that most of us agree are good to do. And it turns out these moral philosophers, the experts on the good, they are indistinguishable from the rest of the population. You know, they're just statistically indistinguishable. And that reminds me very much of one of my favorite philosophers, Diogenes, if I pronounce that correctly, of Sinope, the Greek philosopher who was always, he came down very hard on those who said one thing and then didn't apply it in practice. There's this wonderful anecdote of him sitting in the sun, just lounging and relaxing a little bit. And then Alexander the Great comes along because he has heard about Diogenes, the great philosopher. And he says, well, is there anything I can do for you? And Diogenes says, well, if you can just step out of the light, you're standing in the sun. I mean, he gave, how do you say that? 0 fucks, if I pronounce that correctly. But that's often a feeling I have with many intellectuals and philosophers and great thinkers and blah, blah, blah. If you don't apply your own ideas in practice, if they don't have any consequences for your own life, then, how valuable are they anyway? One of my favorite thinkers right now, the Lebanese statistician Nicholas Nassim Taleb, one of his books is called Skin in the Game, where he says, don't tell me what you think, tell me what's in your portfolio, right? This is often how people in the financial industry say, don't tell me what you think about this or that company. Tell me in what company you invest, because that's what you really think.
I want to get back to one of the questions. So it's difficult, it's easier to change the world than change yourself. What can we do today to change ourselves? What is our part of the problem to gain back the trust to the institutions and the state? And can we do something?
I think so, yes. So another quote that's been going around in my head for the past couple of months is a quote from Margaret Mead. She's an anthropologist. And many people will be familiar with it. It's something like, never underestimate the power of a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Now, this quote is often used by, progressive idealists who say, look, we can change the world because small groups of committed citizens can do it. And Margaret Mead said it. But if you think about that quote for a little bit longer, it's actually quite brutal, especially the second part. She says, in fact, it's the only thing that ever has. The only thing that has ever changed the world, for the better or for the worse, are small groups of committed citizens. Therefore, the vast majority of people don't change the world because the vast majority of people just live their lives, which is fine, right? I mean, we humans, we are social creatures who want to bond with our friends, who many of us want to have kids, etc. But those are not the kind of people who change the world. Actually, if you use a metaphor, we're basically on an airplane, and there's no one in the cockpit, or at least it's relatively easy to step into the cockpit and to say, well, no, we're going to left right now or to the right, right? And that is both a terrifying and a liberating thought, is that because there's actually a very small percent of people who are pretty deliberate about changing the world, you can change the world, just like the abolitionists did, or the suffragettes did, the women who were fighting for the women's right to vote. Were they the most powerful group in society? No. Were they the richest group in society? No. But they did have an extraordinarily powerful idea. A lot of people think that this world is governed by the rich elites, who come together at Davos. Well, I've been there, and it's a pretty underwhelming experience, I can assure you. I've met a couple of billionaires by now, and, well, most billionaires won't be remembered by historians. They made their way in money in some silly way, with corruption, with fossil fuels, with real estate or whatever. And now they're mainly busy with, I don't know, their art collection or how big their yacht is. A lot of billionaires are pretty pathetic, if you ask me, and they won't be remembered. But there are small groups of people who can actually change the world if they're much more deliberate about where they want to go. And so, as I said, that is a scary thought. But if you're the one who wakes up to that insight, I think you can do extraordinary things. one of the last books I read was a book by Rutger Bregman. She's a vegan activist in the United States, and she believes that factory farming is one of the greatest crimes of our age. And she's been working for decades and in a pretty successful way to try and change farming practices in the United States. And to get back to your initial question, one of the ways she does it is she tries to build alliances with farmers themselves, which is really difficult and unusual because a lot of vegans, their veganism is more about themselves, right? They're like, oh, I'm so pure, I'm the good person, blah, blah, blah. But the animals don't care about you, right? The animals just don't want to be killed and tortured. That's what they would prefer. So they care about the results. And so what Rutger Bregman has been doing is to connect with the farmers who are also quite often pretty dissatisfied with the system, right? They don't enjoy, the huge scale in which they have to treat these animals pretty badly. And so together they took up the fight against the multinationals. It's one of the truly inspiring examples that I've heard about in the past couple of months. But I guess it all starts with that realization, is that, yes, small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, and you can be one of them.
Since you mentioned veganism, I have a question from a fan. Her name is Kalliopi Theodoraki. You mentioned in the book the power of shame and how it can work as a control on power, especially when rules don't work. Mm-hmm. And she was talking about how vegan outreach works. Mm-hmm. If I understood correctly, is about the way vegans make us feel shameful about mm-hmm. consuming meat. But mm-hmm. I want to take it a bit further and have your opinion on cancel culture and mm-hmm. how it could be an evolution of the shame, the work of shame, the utility of shame.
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's nothing wrong with shame. We are pretty much the only animal in the animal kingdom with the ability to blush. And yes, social movements still make use of that fact every day. And sure, so, I mean, there are many examples of that very fact, getting out of hand and people getting canceled for the wrong reasons, et cetera, et cetera. But cancel culture is not a new phenomenon. It's been with us since forever. Nomadic hunter-gatherers were canceling others all the time. If you were too narcissistic, if you were too arrogant, they would say, cancel. And you would be cast out of the group and you would die alone, right? That's how we've been policing our communities for a very long time. We humans, we gossip and we gossip and we gossip all the time about each other. And I mean, you can say, all of that is wrong. And sure, I mean, sometimes it gets out of hand, but it's also what keeps our societies together. And we care about what other people think about us. And I think what would the alternative be? A society of complete sociopaths where no one cares about anyone? I wouldn't want to live in that society. In fact, I don't think it could ever exist as a society, because it would, that's what, that would be like Squid Game, right? It would completely break down. Yes, shame can be a pretty useful tool. It doesn't feel nice, but who says that everything should feel nice, right? Physical pain doesn't feel good, right? I don't particularly enjoy it when I bump my head into, a wall or something like that. But I think my body is trying to tell me something at that point. And shame is similar, right? It's your psyche that's saying, well, maybe don't go there because this hurts and this is not good for society. What I'm obviously worried about is what we now have is a phenomenon of survival of the shameless. Is that so many people who turn out to be invulnerable to shame actually seem to have a competitive advantage in our societies. I'm not an expert on the particulars here in Greece, but I think there are many examples throughout the globe of politicians who just seem to have lost their ability to feel any shame at all, right? We can't even imagine them blushing anymore. And somehow that has become an advantage to them because they can do things that most of us would be just too ashamed to do, right? So, yes, I see the downsides of shame, right? The shame of poverty, cancel culture sometimes getting out of hand. But I really want to remind people that the alternative, having no shame at all, is so much worse.
Since you mentioned Greece, at least in politics, one of the things that we see is that people don't resign. Politicians don't really resign in Greece. We see it in movies, in TV series. We hear that it happens in other countries. But here, no one resigns. It's, I don't know why.
That does sound problematic.
It is, yes.
Because you need some feedback mechanisms that when someone is caught in a lie or when basically someone should be really ashamed that what you do is you get out, right?
Yes.
You're expelled. And at least you need a cool-off period. So, well, it's something to think about.
Just a couple of fun questions. Michaela Kalasi, she is wondering, why are your books orange? Is it mindful? Is it something that you do on purpose? Is it?
It's the national color of the Netherlands.
Okay, you know. I thought about
that. No, it was. I mean, it was initially decided by my British publisher, and we just thought it was a fun, bright color that conveys a certain optimism and hopefulness. So. Yes, and then when you design the cover for the second book, I mean, it's nice if they work well together. So, but there's not much deeper thought behind it. There's no, I don't know, deep symbolic meaning behind the orange.
Okay, this is the Greek cover, if you haven't seen it, and unfortunately, we have lost the wordplay. The humankind doesn't work with a Greek word.
So, how do you pronounce the title in Greek?
It's anthropότητα. It's humankind. Humanity, and the subtitle is «Μια απροσδόκητα αισιόδοξη ιστορία». It's an unexpected, optimistic story.
Oh, I like that.
Something like
that. I like that.
Yes. So, another fun question. Labros Stavrinopoulos. It's actually a fun question for me. He says, how do you want to be remembered in 400 years from now? I don't know what he chose, 400 years. As a utopian who tried to change the world, or as a wise man who saw the obvious? He also has a third option, or as the folk hero of Davos.
I am pretty sure that I won't be remembered 400 years from now. I'll already be happy if I'll be remembered 40 years from now, or even 4. No, actually, it's a good way to think about the value of your work, right? We are often obsessed with what people think about us today, what our friends think about us today, what our family members think about us today. In my case, what my readers think about me today, or the people who review my book. But the best test, the best reviewer is time, right? Does something persist? Does something stand the test of time? It's something I've been keeping in my mind a lot while I was reading, when I was writing Humankind. I was continuously asking myself the question, will this hold up 10 years from now? You know, this fancy new scientific theory that was published in Science or Nature, you know, two of the prestigious scientific journals, that really fits my theory and I really want to believe, will it hold up 10 years from now? Will it be replicated? And you know what's interesting? When you ask that question, you start to rely on research traditions instead of fancy new studies that just came out. Because if something that was developed in the 1950s and is still taught today, right, is still believed today, then it has stood the test of time. And it's much more likely to, you know, live for another 50 years or even longer than that. This is described by the statistician that I recently just mentioned, you know, Nicholas Taleb, as the Lindy effect. So, you know, as you and I become older, our life expectancy goes down, right? You know, it statistically becomes likely that we die sooner rather than later as time progresses. But with really great books, when they live longer and longer and longer, actually their life expectancy goes up, right? Which is really strange. In a way, you can almost become immortal in this way. And it's happened to the great classics of literature, right? Take Homer, for example, you know, the Odyssey. Just the fact that it's been with us for, what is it, more than 2,000 years, yes, means that it will stay with us for so much longer. I think it will be with us till the end of human civilization. Now, I think it's extremely unlikely that any of my books will live for that long. But it is, as a writer, a good question to keep in mind. If you want to write a book that people will read 20 years from now, you got to write a book that people would have read 20 years ago. You see? And so many articles, books, videos, etc., you know, they don't hold up. Think about the newspaper that you receive every day. People don't even want to read yesterday's newspaper. Yes. How worthless must the information be that's in the newspaper if people don't even want to read it a day later, right? It must be completely, utterly worthless. So, yeah, as a writer, I ask that question a lot, you know, and I'm thinking about, you know, how will people in the future read this?
I think at least I can read another question behind that question. Is this book a scientific testament of how humanity works, or is it in a percentage, a manifesto, something that you want to tell us and persuade us to become better? Because if you don't, we will become bad.
I would say it's both of those things. So on the one hand, the first half of the book is about this silent revolution that has started, I would say, around 30 years ago in science, where so many scientists from so many different disciplines have moved to a much more hopeful view of human nature. And in the book, I wanted to connect the dots to basically show that something bigger is going on. As you know, scientists these days are very, very specialized. They know everything about their tiny little part of the puzzle. What I wanted to do is to connect the dots and really show, you know, this is part of a whole new movement. That's the scientific part of the book. Now, the second half of the book is about applying the theory in practice. Because once you assume that most people are fundamentally decent deep down, it changes everything. It changes the way you built your schools, your prisons, how you organize your democracy, how you structure your companies, etc. It changes everything. Some people, you know, may think, oh, this book about human kindness, you know, it's just a self-helpy lifestyle book, you know, that to make you feel good and read it on a beach or something like that. And sure, I mean, by all means, read it on a beach and feel good about it. But the second step is to put it into practice, because the consequences are enormous. Everything starts with your view of human nature, how you look at other people. And once you update your theory, once you assume that most people deep down are pretty decent, you can do everything in a radically different way.
When you mentioned Ted Lasso, I think Ted Lasso is a great example of how embarrassing it is to be hopeful in a cynical world. But I really believe, and this is based on my life experience, that at the end, it's better. This is the way to go. Cynicism gets you early wins, but the long game is won by hopeful.
I agree. It's just a better way to live your life.
Exactly, yes.
So at the end of the book, I talk about one of the life lessons of assuming the best in everyone around you. And it's about con artists, right? We probably experience that sometimes, right? All of us, that you will encounter someone who just wants to rip you off, right? Who just wants to con you. You know, it happened to me quite a while ago now. I was a student. I lived in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and it was late. It was around 11 p.m. And a man came up to me and he said, look, my car just broke down and I had to leave my kids and my wife. And I really need money for a cab to get back to them, blah, blah, blah. It was a very weird story. But I remember like making the decision very quickly. I sort of immediately said to myself, okay, I'm going to trust this man because he really seems to be in a panic and I don't want to question him. I just don't. I don't want to ask any critical question. So he said, do you have any money? I said, no, I don't have it on me. But we walked to an ATM and I, you know, got the money out of the wall. And I said, well, here's 50 euros, which was a lot for me at the time. You know, it was like my all my beer money as a student, right? It was very important. And he said, yeah, I'll transfer the money back to you. What's your number, etc. I came back home, and my girlfriend, who's now my wife, she said, "Oh my God, Rutger, I really love you, but you're such an idiot." I mean, you're such an idiot. And I
you
thought,
said, I will write a book about it.
and I said, no. The money will come back. I'm pretty sure about it. But then a day later, you know, I heard nothing about it. A week later, nothing. A month later, nothing. And, you know, I was conned. And I remember feeling quite ashamed, right? This feeling of shame. Like, how could I be so stupid? How could I not even ask one simple question, right? And his story would have collapsed. But while I was writing this book, I actually became a little proud. And I started to realize that if you've never been conned, then you should really see a therapist, right? Because then your basic attitude to life is just not trusting enough. We humans, we can function in society because we trust most other people. Trust is the oxygen. Trust is the water we swim in. And you should never be ashamed for trusting someone else. And what I realize is that if I have to pay the price of being conned a couple of times in my life, I'll gladly pay the price. Because the benefit of trusting pretty much everyone I meet all the time is so much greater than the downside of, you know, being conned and feeling a little shame every now and then.
Thank you very much. Trust is the oxygen. I really like that. Let's finish on that note. Do you have any final say on your Greek fan base?
Well, I'm very, very grateful, you know, for all the Greek readers. It's just super amazing to have your book out in Greece, and I hope to come there some day if we can find time. Maybe sometime in the future. But for now, I'm just really grateful for everyone who's reading the book, and especially to you, Yiannis. I mean, you've made it great in Greece.
No, I really enjoyed it. It was easy. So thank you again. Thanks to Klidárithmos Publications for arranging everything, for giving me the opportunity to meet you, and a lot of thanks to Yafka Bookstore in Thessaloniki who are hosting this interview. And
Bum, 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 bum.